Hey guys, back with the second video in our week on contemporary grand theories, part one. Because we're dealing with 3 this week, we'll deal with 4 next week. So the grand theory that we're dealing with this week is called structural functionalism. And when you hear structural functionalism, the main thing that I want you to think right away is society is an organism. All of its structures are its organs. They all play a function or play a role in the functioning of that society. So everything kind of meshes together well. Robert Merton's is going to help refine that in a way that's more realistic, but that's the basic idea of structural functionalism. Society is an organism. Everything within society is an organ that helps it to be able to survive. We have to define 2 terms right away, structure and function. Structure is defined in a very specific and kind of non-intuitive way. So generally speaking, when we hear the word structure, we think of a physical concrete thing that has been built. For sociology in general and structural functionalism in particular, social structures need to be thought of as patterned social interactions. So social interactions between or among people that happen in a patterned way over and over and over again. An example of this would be the patterned interaction that you have with me, you as a student, me as a professor. We have a very specifically patterned way of interacting with each other. There's all kinds of ways that you and I could interact, but we don't. And even if we weren't online, like what would happen is I would walk into a classroom, you would walk into a classroom, I would lecture to you, you would take notes, you would ask questions, I would answer them, and that would basically be it. And then you'd show up in office hours every once in a while and I would give you tests, and those are types of interaction too. But you can see the whole thing is completely patterned. There is very little room for improvisation within that. That's what we want to think of as a social structure. And just as your relationship with me is defined by that particular pattern, your relationship with all of your professors pretty much follows the same pattern. My relationship with all of my students pretty much follows the same pattern. The relationships between professors and students in California basically follows the same pattern. So that idea of social interactions that are patterned and are consistent within a society, that's what we want to think of as social structure. So we've got the educational social structure that we just talked about. We also have economic social structures where you go to work and you are expected to follow the dictates of whatever your boss says. You go in on the consumption side of the economy, you go to the grocery store, and your interactions are patterned there as well. That's it. Structures are patterns of social interaction. The function part is a little bit more intuitive. It's just the consequences that help a particular system or society survive or adapt to new circumstances. So it's functional. It helps the society function. All right, so that's structural functionalism for you. In the book, they talk about the Davis-Moore theory about stratification. That's a great classic example of it. Stratification is a pattern of social interactions in which some people end up high up with a lot of money and prestige, other people end up low down, and it persists, and they say it needs to because it's functional for society. It helps make sure that the most capable and qualified people end up at the top, that they end up in the most important roles in society, and that the people who are less capable are able to be filtered down into the less important roles in society, and that society needs that because it needs the most capable people at the top in the most important roles. Make sure that you get, I'm not going to go into more detail about it. There are lots of criticisms of that. It's a fairly naive perspective on stratification in particular, because we know that racism and sexism play a role in keeping highly qualified women and highly qualified racial minorities out of the top positions. So it's a theory that is ripe for criticism, but it's an important example of what structural functionalism is about. Okay, but the main event is Talcott Parsons, who is just absolutely brutal. And he's a good example of how these grand theories are better for orienting our thinking than giving us tools for analysis. Talcott Parsons got so general in trying to incorporate every single possible thing that exists within society rather than focusing in on a few and making a coherent story about them. That wasn't what he was interested in. He was interested in explaining everything. And in doing that, it becomes so general that I would argue it doesn't give you a lot of good analytical tools for understanding any particular social phenomenon. But that said, I do think it's useful in terms of understanding, in terms of giving us an orientation for our thinking. And so for Parsons, what we need to know is AGIL. In fact, in my very first semester in graduate school, I remember asking one of my professors about Talcott Parsons, and she said AGIL. And I said, what does that mean? And she said, I really don't know, but that's what you have to know. So that's what you're going to know. AGIL it refers to adaptation, goal attainment, integration, and I don't know why L stands for latency and pattern management, but it does. It does. All right. So the perspective that Talcott Parsons takes is that societies are not just organisms. They are organisms that exist like any organism. They exist in an ecosystem, just like a squirrel exists in the ecosystem of the forest among a whole bunch of other organisms. American society, or any society, exists within an ecosystem of other societies. And so, as an organism in an ecosystem, it has to do several things. 4, kind of 5. I don't know why it's not AGILP. It has to do these things, create structures that satisfy these functions. So, adaptation. A society has to adjust to its environment, and to an extent adjust the environment to its needs. I'm not crazy about that part of the definition, but I suppose it's true. I mean, America has gotten itself into all kinds of trouble because we have adjusted the environment to our needs, and now we've got climate change that is something else that we have to adjust to. But not just the natural environment. So we create structures to adjust to the environment. In terms of the natural environment, we create the Environmental Protection Agency as an example of a structure that we have created to help us adjust our society to the ecosystem that we live in this case, the natural ecosystem. But we also have to adjust to the other organisms that exist within the ecosystem. So, for example, right now in America, at least at the time that I'm creating this, Russia and China are sort of the big other players that we have got to adjust to. And so we create structures that help us do that. So we create the Department of State, we create the CIA, we create national security organizations that help us be able to relate to and protect ourselves from those other organisms. All right, that's adaptation. The society has to adapt to the environment around it, and we create structures to do that. Moving my script down a little bit, goal attainment. So we're not just trying to exist within this ecosystem, we're trying to thrive within the ecosystem. And so what we do is we also create goals and then try to attain those goals. For America, we want, because we're hoping to, in an ideal world, take care of the people that live within the society, we try to, as a goal, grow our economy. And part of growing our economy means trade relationships with other countries. It means creating economic structures that will allow us to create wealth so that people can have decent standards of living. So things like the Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve, but also all of the corporations, including like the little mom and pop restaurants. Those are all, Talcott Parsons would say, structures that our society creates in order to meet the goal of expanding our economy. That's probably good for that. So goal attainment. We create structures to allow us to attain our goals. Integration. Integration means it's a little bit different than the way Durkheim talked about integration. For Talcott Parsons, although I guess I should say this at this point. Structural functionalism's kind of not founding father, because he wasn't really a structural functionalist, but sort of the inspiration for it is Emil Durkheim, because Durkheim, you remember, he talked about things like crime as having a function for society. It shows you where the norms are in society. And so kind of based on that idea, structural functionalism kind of gets spun out. But integration within structural functionalism is a little bit different than Durkheimian integration. It's not about integrating people, it's about integrating all those structures. So we have created all of these things, and we need a way of coordinating them so that they work well together. And in a general way, the government and different government agencies, but also Congress. Congress writes laws that are designed to kind of create for example, an educational system that's going to work well with the economy as it is right now. So integrating those different structures. All right, and then in my opinion, latency and pattern management. First of all, Parsons could have named these things, given them names that were a little bit more intuitive, but latency and pattern management are the worst of all of them. Latency refers to the need for a system to give people motivation. So, most of structural functionalism flies way above the level of individuals. But here, Talcott Parsons is aware of the fact that ultimately these structures are they are patterns of interaction, and the interactors are you and me. We have to have the right motivation in order to make the social structures work in a way that will allow for our adaptation and our goal attainment. So, but that motivation isn't just there all the time. It has to be put there, the proper motivation. So we need social structures that will do that. The social structures, the most basic one is our education system. Through our education system, we learn that we should be pursuing a job, and we should be working hard toward being successful in whatever field we have, and possibly climbing the ladder to get promotions. All of that is stuff that we learn from education, from the family also, as well as from the mass media. We get the right motivation from those, particularly those three big social institutions and the organizations that exist within them. All right, that's latency. And the difference between latency and pattern management is latency is really micro level, so individuals, the motivations that individuals get. The pattern maintenance part is slightly above that level. It is making sure that we have the right cultural patterns, the right values and norms to go into our people's heads. I know that's a little bit abstract, but you think about, so what I was just talking about with education, we talk about the value of being successful. So education gets it into kids' heads, but that value has to exist in the first place in order to be put into kids' heads. That level is pattern maintenance. Creating the right, you want to think about this as pattern of thinking to end up in people's heads. And the place where we're going to get that is primarily going to be through the mass media corporations. All right, that is a quick, not that quick, we're at 15 minutes, whip through of AGIL. the last things I want to say about it, and I apologize for how long this is, the last things I want to say about it is Talcott Parsons said, so everything that I just said was at the societal level. Parsons would say, in his ideal world, because he's trying to explain everything, you should be able to scale that down to like a university and say, well, a university has to adapt, have goal attainment structures within the university that are supposed to be focused on all of these things. Don't sweat it too much. When most people talk about structural functionalism, what they're talking about is the structures and the functions of those structures for the society as a whole. All right, that is it. In conclusion, we got this. It's hard to know what we do with it. I mean, how does this help you in any particular, in analyzing any particular social phenomenon? I mean, you could say, so we know that the stratification system, for example, is about giving people the right motivation. So it's functioning at that latency level, and it's also helping us in terms of our goal attainment because it's making sure that the right people get into the right places. And then you're done, kind of. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have a whole lot more to do with structural functionalism. It's so general that it's more about orienting your thinking in that way, which is good. That's a useful thing. We're not going to be able to analyze a whole lot with those tools until Robert Merton comes along, who's going to come along in our next lecture, and he's going to refine the theory a little bit and make it a little bit more realistic, because this is all, everything is useful and helpful, and your experience of society is probably somewhat similar to mine, which is society is kind of a disaster a lot of the time. I mean, some things go well, but a lot of things go horribly. Robert Merton's going to say, look, Parsons, thank you for this, but we've got to have some concepts that are going to deal with the fact that society is messed up a lot of the time. We'll deal with that in the next lecture.